All right. Hello and welcome everybody to this relatively impromptu webinar put on by SONAR. I'm Zach Strickland, Director of Freight Market Intelligence. Today I'm joined by Mike Bowdendistel, our Head of Intermodal and Maritime, as well as Tony Mulvey, Senior Research Analyst here. We're going to have a bit of a roundtable discussion around the impact of tariffs. Of course, we've come to a point where we've got two pauses on Mexico and Canada. And China looks like that's staying in place. The purpose of today's discussion is to kind of dive a little deeper, not necessarily explore the entire granularity of what these tariffs mean, but certainly get a little bit of clarity over what it could potentially do moving forward, some of the other tariff influences throughout the course of the year. We've started off the year with a relative bang, if you will, in terms of geopolitical kind of craziness and chaos, something that a lot of the shipping community is very nervous about, and rightfully so. So I will start things off by first saying that we're right now, the situation is our newly elected President Trump has come into office and said he is potentially levying 25% tariffs on China or on Canada, Mexico, and a 10% on China. The 10% is currently in place right now, getting placed in, as well as we have two pauses on Canada and Mexico. Now, I'm going to kick things over to Mike to add some further context around what exactly that means from the side of what are we seeing happen in terms of the overall retaliation and what potential commodities are affected as well on our end?
Sure. So the first thing was, late yesterday, we had a 30-day extension. So that's not going to take place. It was supposed to take place today. They pushed it out for 30 days for both Canada and Mexico, like you said, but not China. And, in terms of Canada was a little bit more clear and what they plan to do in terms of retaliatory tariffs. And they sounds like they're going to do kind of a rotational program where they're going to have tariffs at 25% on certain industries and rotate those over a period of time to other industries. I guess they don't want to just have it on everything because they don't want to hurt their own, companies. Mexico's been a little less clear. I don't think we know what their ultimate retaliation will be if those tariffs actually do go into place at some point. I think for China, what's different about China is it's not going to be so much tariffs that are a retaliation, but it could also be just trying to find the choke points in the supply chain. I mean, there's certain things that were exposed during COVID where just, how are we so exposed to China for our PP&E and drug ingredients and components of lithium batteries and just those things. So they may not want to supply those things. They may just really target certain industries where we have a hard time finding an alternative.
Yeah, and Tony, before I kick it over to you to kind of explain some of the commodities we're talking about here from each of these countries, I think it's important to note that the overt or the surface level reason that we're seeing these tariffs levied are because of fentanyl and immigration policies. And basically Trump is saying that there's not enough effort from these three countries in preventing, the cross-border flow of fentanyl, which has become the largest illicit drug used in the United States. Over 70% of the drug flowing in the United States, use in the United States, has become fentanyl. It's replacing heroin. It's an opioid. And most of that fentanyl is being produced in China. And it is coming in, the majority is coming into Mexico. They're shipping it across the ocean into Mexico. And then it's crossing the borders of California and Arizona, primarily to cartels involved with that. And the internet can help you out with the further detail there. But Trump's basically saying, I need you to help me out here and put a little bit more effort into stopping this. And whereas this current president in Mexico has been more active than the previous one, who would not admit that there was a fentanyl situation there, he is basically saying, I need for you to make a little bit more effort on these cross-border efforts. So she has now said she's going to position 10,000 more troops at the border. Now, there's a lot of criticism here. This feels a little bit like a superficial effort. A lot of the experts in the DEA do not necessarily feel like this is going to be a very effective maneuver and even putting a dent in this. A lot of the fentanyl is, of course, produced without color or smell. Therefore, it's also produced legally for a lot of the drugs being distributed in the United States in medical situations. So it's extremely difficult to detect. And also it's very hard to regulate. So there's a lot of debate over whether or not this can even be something that they can tackle in the cross-border situations. But regardless, here we are. Tony, tell us a little bit about the commodity flows from China, Mexico, and Canada, because even though we've hit pause, we're not out of the woods on either of China and Mexico. We've basically gotten, like I said, I'm making a little bit of an effort on the surface as they hash out further details on what's about to occur.
Yeah, I think on the Canada side, the big one's energy, and I think it's probably the most nuanced, and it's because the tariff there wasn't 25%, it was 10%. So that's where we're big importers of Canadian energy, and I don't think that's a surprise. I mean, if you looked at crude production in the U.S., I mean, it's right around 13.5 million barrels a day. The average consumption's right around 20 million barrels a day. So, I mean, you're talking to have to offset basically 7 million barrels a day. So we're still importing a lot of crude oil and energy sources. So that's Canada's big one. The automotive sector, also big, probably bigger with the Mexico side. That's the largest probably commodity that flows back and forth. But I think one of the other interesting ones from Mexico is produce. And I think that's probably where this would have been the most impactful, just given the timing. If you look at kind of when things are brought in or the values of produce brought across the border, it starts picking up, call it January, February, and peaks kind of June, July, before tailing off to the back half of the year. So like getting hit with a 25% tariff around produce peaking, it would be a challenge. China, I mean, I think you kind of already touched on it a little. I mean, it's a lot of electrical equipment, semiconductors. I think there's a lot of low, I'll call it cheap things from Temu and Shein and the like. So things like that aren't high value goods that, they're getting that situation's be getting hit with a double whammy, right? De minimis exemption going away and a 10% tariff. It's like a double whammy from that front. So those are probably the big ones, probably the most impactful. I think you look at the Canada side, I mean, talking about tariffing American alcohol and spirits. I think that's an interesting play overall. But I think the big ones are automotive, energy, and then that electrical equipment, some of the manufacturing inputs coming from China.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because a lot of the data, especially some of the data you found specifically, was around the value. So electronics and energy, oil derivatives are going to get more value, but they don't necessarily take up the most space. I think that's an important factor to note. I think I did a quick math on your spreadsheet, which came from government data. 28% of the overall value that comes from China is through electronics, 18% with appliances. Canada or Mexico, 26% of the value was automotive equipment and parts, 17% electronics, and 17% appliances. Canada, a third of it was oil. And then 12% coming in second was automotive, and then about a 7% appliances situation. So the valuable stuff is going to be the electronics, the appliances. Those are going to have the most impact from tariffs. Those are going to be the things that I would think that we would see some level of inflation. Now, I want to pose the next question, because I think from a shipping perspective, forecasting demand, if they were to implement these tariffs, is a 25% enough to think about moving supply chains or moving procurement into other places? Or is it just still so cheap I mean, China's 10%, so maybe that's a better place to start. Are these tariffs still just too cheap to even make that decision, especially considering the fact that Trump will have 4 years? And in that 4 years, a lot of those policies may not be permanent. Thoughts here?
I think in and of itself, it's not enough to make a decision of whether you're going to have manufacturing in China or someplace else. I don't think that 10% is going to move the needle. Now, Trump did say that's just sort of maybe the precursor to a much more significant tariff. So you do have to keep that in mind. But another thing that we've seen over the last several years is there's been a share gain in elsewhere in Southeast Asia, places like Taiwan and Vietnam, an increase in manufacturing there that has exceeded the growth rate in China. So the China production there that's coming to the United States has been pretty flat over the last several years that we've seen in our data, where we've seen a lot more growth in Taiwan and Vietnam. And a lot of companies just really want to reduce their exposure to China because there's just more geopolitical risk there. You don't want to get into a situation where China's persona non grata the way that Russia has become. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with all those things. So I think in any event, tariff or not, you want to maybe reduce your exposure to China, or at least reduce your reliance on China.
Yeah, I think that's go ahead, Tony.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think when you look, the other interesting part is, like, if you look at the cost of labor in Mexico versus the cost of labor in China, it's actually like it's far cheaper now, the cost of labor in Mexico. So it's like, is the difference in that, call it 15%, right? 25% on Mexico versus 10% in China. Is that enough to offset the labor savings currently in Mexico? And I mean, to me, it doesn't seem likely. I mean, enough to like, I think Mexico's still that area of growth, even at 25%. I think China is probably, I think the risk in China is that bigger, more extreme tariff possibilities are on the horizon over the, call it, next 4 years, where it seems like Mexico and Canada are more likely to, negotiate and play, I don't want to say play the game, but kind of go that route.
So I've pulled up the Inbound Ocean TEU's volume index to kind of, because we just got a question come in. I think this is, the timing's right. How do you foresee this impacting the freight market over the next 30 days? Do you anticipate something similar to 2018? I think we are already there. To answer the question from my perspective, if you look at this chart, the white line is basically an index that measures orders for containers, 20-foot equivalent units, going from all over the world, including China, Vietnam, India, China is the biggest one, to the United States. And we're going through this period of Lunar New Year where we just came into it, January 29th, where we see this pull forward activity. And if you look at these lines, the orange lines, the green line, those are COVID years. That's where we were seeing a ton of imports because of COVID. There was a lot of pull forward activity. We're currently underperforming last year just by a skosh. If you look at the kind of muted teal colored line, Mike, I'm going to pose this one to you. And do you think that any of this initial disruption is going to potentially have an upward pressure on this index moving forward throughout the rest of the year? Or do you think that we've kind of already had enough pull forward to where shippers are relatively comfortable in their cadence?
I do think we've had a lot of pull forward. Like if you just, instead of that IOTI.USA, you just want to look at IOTI.USLAX and just concentrate on the port of LA. Like they've been hitting new records for a number of months in a row, trending 15 or 20% above where they typically would be. So, I mean, some of that was, avoiding the potential ILA situation. But a lot of it also, seems to have been a pull forward. It's an interesting comment that, you had the other day on your Freightonomics show where Dr. Zach Rogers talked about the inventory situation and how the inventories are pretty elevated in some of the upstream markets, like the California Inland Empire, and a little bit leaner in the downstream markets closer to consumption centers because there was a strong sell-through during the holiday season. So I think there has been a lot of pull forward. It seemed like there was a little bit of early move ahead of Chinese New Year. Even taking into consideration the Chinese New Year was earlier this year than has been typically. But you still may see a little bit more front loading just because we don't know exactly what's going to happen with the China tariffs. From my perspective, I think the China tariffs are more likely to stick. And yes, as someone pointed out in the chat, yes, incremental 10% on top of what was already there, not 10% in total. So it does seem like there is some pull forward, but you have to be careful not to order too much. I mean, we saw a couple of years ago how Walmart and Target were really stuck with just way too much inventory, particularly Target, and they really had to take some pretty big actions to get rid of that, that inventory. And even companies like that benefit from that, like TJ Maxx, has had a good run the last few years because of the over ordering. So they do have to be a little bit careful not to over order.
Tony, you were on that show. I'm going to pull up the rates chart here. I've had several questions around what does this mean for maritime moving forward in terms of the rate situation. We've got Freightos Baltic Exchange pulled up here. I'll just go out to the 5-year chart. This is a daily index. Spot rates for 40-foot containers moving from China to North America's east coasts. They're in white, and west coasts. They're in the yellow. And we saw this strange occurrence last year where we had the Red Sea obviously having a big influence on this market, but we saw rate inflation all the way into the middle of the year. I would love to get both of you guys' takes on what this means as the Red Sea conflict is kind of being resolved at this moment. We're getting some of the carriers saying they're going to start operating. They're transitioning to operating back in the Red Sea again. That should remove what was perceived as the majority of the pressure in this market. Do you think that these new tariffs put a renewed pressure on these rates moving forward, or do you think that that's a non-issue?
Well, we'll see. I mean, if you look at that chart, sort of the right part of that chart, starting in 2024, I mean, that's where the Houthi attacks started, right at the beginning of 2024. So you saw that big jump up, came back down, and then you saw the jump up that was even higher than that, which I don't think people were anticipating. But right around the time of our conference in Atlanta that year, there were all these reports of shortages of international containers, and so that was part of the reason that was driving that higher. Is there weren't a lot of international containers, and then lately there's been disruptions. I mean, part of the reason was just disruptions at certain ports around the world, like port of Singapore. Sort of going forward, I mean, it certainly would have a big impact if both the attacks stopped, which it looks like they're diverting their attention elsewhere, and the carriers decided to use the Red Sea sort of in full force. Like I've seen estimates that those longer routings along the southern part of Africa took out something like 8 to 10% of the capacity of the ocean capacity. So it has been very significant, on the capacity side, how much that's taken out. And then also, when you think about ocean capacity, you have to consider the fact that there's a lot on the order books for this year and for next year. This year, it's going to be something like 8%. Next year, I think something like 6% of added capacity. A lot of those bookings were made, during the pandemic when those ocean carriers were hitting, new record highs. So there is the potential for a lot more capacity to come in the market, and that may be the ultimate, driver of the ocean rates. But yeah, I mean, there's demand risk there too. I think most people kind of assume that, we're going to have a continued growth in global trade. I mean, it could go the other way, and you could have a situation where demand is falling while capacity is rising on the ocean side. And then there's a lot that could happen with the different topic, but a lot that could happen on the air freight market with the elimination of the de minimis. That's really what Shein and Temu were using.
Tony, you want to elaborate, especially on the de minimis portion?
I mean, yeah, I will. I mean, I was just going to echo Mike's thoughts real quick. Is like, it feels like when you add capacity back, you add capacity, and then the Red Sea conflict, provided it resolves itself. I mean, it feels like, this is kind of setting up to slide throughout the year. I don't know the extent, but anytime
wasn't it set up to slide this past year? I mean, the capacity was growing. We did see
Yeah,
a little bit of an increase in demand, yet
yeah,
these
but
rates, and these are spot rates, mind you.
yeah, I think some of it. I mean, you saw an increase in demand. I mean, that was when you really actually look at it. I mean, it's comparable, maybe not to the full extreme, but I mean, it was the strongest demand levels that we had had in. I mean, outside of what the 18 months of COVID, like it far exceeded that. Like not COVID levels, but I mean, it was close. I mean, it was strong. I think the difference is one, added capacity. I think domestically here helped kind of absorb all the freight that was coming over when you're before you didn't have that same kind of impacts, right? I think that played an impact in what happened throughout in 24. I mean, I think if you were to look at it, I mean, and Mike can touch on it. I mean, you had the intermodal, domestic intermodal side of the market grew significantly throughout the year. It was added capacity that they started adding. I mean, they were taking delivery of it, that they were growing from, the bull run of 2020 through 2022. And I think that's some of this. I think the de minimis part is probably more interesting, though, when you start looking at
Explain
like,
explain the de minimis real quick. Just give a quick backdrop of the de minimis in it
yeah,
and how it's been handled here recently.
I mean, effectively, it was anything under $800 basically could clear customs and didn't cost anything
Right.
effectively. I mean, if you bought something for $50 from China or the like, it was $50 to, and that's what it cost. I think one of the interesting parts with that going away is now there's more involved. I think it was something like the average in 2023, the average de minimis value good was $54, so well below that, $800 limit. And like you start taking it at $50, I think this highlights it. It goes up to $97 by eliminating it between processing and customs brokerage fees. So I think that's probably the biggest impact is that it will impact things like Timu and Shein and others like that. That I mean, it grown market share significantly. I mean, I think if you looked at it, it's something like in the last 7 years or the 7 years from 2015 to 2023, 7 years, 8 years. Uh, you look at it and basically the number of packages or the volume coming through under the de minimis was up like 470% during that time versus overall growth in customs like throughput was like 14% during that time. So like to me, this has been an area that's grown booming. I think e-commerce sales have had a big part to do that with that. I mean, they're up significantly relative to retail sales. I mean,
Do
past
we
5 years, I
think
think.
do we think that losing this changes how these companies like behave from a supply chain standpoint? Do we see Timu and Shein change their supply chains, maybe have distribution centers in different places, handle their volume differently? Because this is a pretty big inflationary thing on. I mean, this is really they were winning their cost game competitively by gaming the logistics and the supply chain environment. What do they do? Like, does this change in a way that we see volume shift dramatically?
Uh,
I mean, it might involve them upending their entire value proposition. I mean, part of it. I mean, yeah, they're gaming the system in logistics, but they're probably gaming the system in terms of labor too. I mean, it's not clear how much of it is the human rights abuses and the forced labor and the cotton from the Uyghur region and all those things that are going into all of this. So it could all be sort of upended, and it is going to have a huge impact on the air freight market. We have one big SONAR client who ships every which mode all over the world, and he said that it's the air cargo, air freight areas have been just stuffed with this cheap e-commerce stuff and has increased the air freight rates for everyone. So it's had a big impact on the air freight market. It's had a big impact on the parcel market here. Like UPS has been having a disproportionate amount of the growth come from this cheap e-commerce stuff, which they have in the slower part of its network, which they call the smart post. So that's a margin dilutive, and they're trying to get rid of that. Some of that they just redid their agreement with Amazon to move about half as much Amazon volume as they had before, in search of moving higher margin freight, things like healthcare products, and from small and medium businesses. So it has the potential to disrupt a lot of other freight transportation industries, and then the retail industry. Also, I found this really great stat from one of the retail newsletters. So in 2022, Gap, the clothing company, paid $700 million in import duties. H&M paid $205 million in import duties. Shein and Temu paid nothing. So we're talking about leveling the playing field, hopefully, and a big impact to a lot of industries, I think.
I want to talk about some of the most impacted areas of the United States now. We've got a few questions that have come in asking about what's the impact to the domestic freight market. I want to pull up our key market insights page here and inside of SONAR and talk about Laredo. This is fascinating to me because I think before this, Christmas season, Laredo, of course, we talked about it, Tony and Mike, it's very automotive centric on imports and the amount of stuff, the value of stuff coming across the border. There's produce mixed in, of course, that's lower value, but there's a substantial amount here. And Laredo is the largest point of entry. Now, starting in, and this is a measure of the tender rejection index for Laredo in blue, with the outbound tender rejection index for the United States in white. Laredo typically is a pretty well-served environment. However, here in the last 3 to 4 weeks, we've now topped the United States national average and hit 8% rejection rates out of Laredo consistently in January. What are your thoughts here on, is Laredo now becoming a little bit more of a center point in the domestic freight market, or do we still need to focus a lot of our attention on like the ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach, and the LA markets?
I mean, I think Port of LA, Long Beach is still going to reign supreme. I think that's still a big focus. I think what's going to be interesting, because now you have a time frame, right? 30-day pause. I think there'll be actions taken. I mean, what was it? Less than 10 days to prepare for this round or potential. Now you got 30. So I think what you might see is just an increase in the number of tenders coming across and the movements to try to front run to some degree. I mean, you've got the ability. It's harder to do it on the ocean front, right? I mean, you've got, what's the average transit time? Call it 21 days from China to LA. I mean, somewhere 14, in that 15, range. Yeah. So I mean, you're
quoting pandemic transits.
A couple weeks.
So I mean, you're still a couple weeks. So it's hard. Like, there wasn't even enough lead time to kind of react to this, right? Coming across the ocean. I mean, if you had 10 days and to prepare, and it wasn't going to be here. So I think that's something to pay attention to looking at LA in the China. But I do think, I think the cross-border elements will ramp up both Canada,
what I find
U.S. and Mexico. Yes.
What I find fascinating is I pulled up the Laredo market conditions, and now I've pulled up Los Angeles market conditions, and you can see that LA is being very well served right now. And this is kind of a leading question for Mike, and I know we're right at time here, but I'm willing to stay on a little bit longer to get some of this out. But I think Mike, can you help us understand that we've got the intermodal component in LA that isn't as present on the cross-border traffic, or at least in the Laredo traffic, it appears. Is the LA market fairly stable thanks to intermodal?
Yeah, it seems like intermodal, if anything, has gained share. The intermodal volume has been really strong in the last year. Last year, in the first part of the year, you really saw growth, particularly in the international intermodal. In some cases, it was up 20, 30, 40%. So the rails had to deal with that as kind of a mixed issue. But then later in the year, we talked about those international container shortages. Middle part of the year, that gave rise to just more transloading, more domestic intermodal shipments. So there's been a lot of growth. Yeah, if you bring up rail, LAX, outbound LAX, and a lot of this is going to Chicago or Dallas are kind of the two big ones. Atlanta, some of it goes all the way into Harrisburg or Newark, and that's grown faster than the truckload volume. And a couple of reasons for that. One is I think most would say the rail service has been at least adequate, if not good. And a lot of the domestic intermodal companies have made investments in domestic containers, and there's been excess of domestic containers. Like one of the takeaways from the last round of earnings was J.B. Hunt said, well, we have availability of our existing containers, and that's even before considering the containers that we purchased from Walmart, which I think that was 7,500 containers. And so there's been the capacity that's been available. And so you typically don't think of intermodal maybe as being a relief valve from the trucking industry just because it's so concentrated in those sort of core dense lanes. But between LA and Chicago or LA and Dallas, it seems like it has been.
Yeah, it does seem like LA's been a little bit more resilient lately. We had a moment last June, July with the rejection rates and the volumes kind of spiking up there, but it looks like supply chains were able to adapt to that to an extent, pushing our rejection rate now for the LA and Ontario markets back down to sub 4% levels. Very well served. Of course, it is February. It's a little out of season. The sense of urgency isn't necessarily there. Once this Lunar New Year freight shows up, there'll probably be a little bit more pressure on it, but it really doesn't tend to show up till later. So I want to get to a few questions because I know we're a little over time. Question to Tony. Do we think the tariffs will actually go through, or were they just a negotiation ploy?
I mean, it's one of those. It's hard to say because if there's anything that came out of the first Trump administration, its volatility is going to be there. And I think that's the same case now. I do think they were a negotiation ploy, but I mean, I think he's willing to have those conversations and negotiate, but I think he's also, I mean, by implementing on China and 10%, I mean, I think he's willing to put it out there to get something to happen. So I think I do think it's a negotiation ploy, but I think if there's not a willingness to have a conversation, then they will get put through. I think this is going to be something you see not just for the rest of this year, but likely all 4 years.
So question to Mike, have we not seen some companies in China move to India and basically see a growth in inbound to the US from Indian imports?
Sure. I mean, Apple is trying to not have all of its production in China and have some of it in India because they see risk there. I mean, and you're seeing others that are going to like a China plus one strategy. So I have, instead of having all of my manufacturing in China, I want to have some of it in China, some of it in Vietnam, just in case. I mean, what if China invades Taiwan and then all of a sudden, China is our enemy, or maybe just it become a bigger focus, the forced labor and those things. If it becomes just more in focus, then it's doing business in China is going to make you have the opposite of DEI or have the opposite of being a good, corporate steward. So I think you have to diversify. And I think India is a good place to do that in addition to Southeast Asia.
Do we think that there's going to be any other kind of countries of interest that might disrupt the natural flow of supply chain freight?
I mean, Central and South America, I think, are an underutilized resource in addition to Mexico. I don't think Mexico is going to stop being a growth, area just because we have this threat of tariff.
Yeah. So I think that's all we have time for. Thanks for everybody for tuning in today. This recording will be available. I don't know when quite yet, but we will probably be sending out a message on that on our SONAR website. But thank you, Mike. Thank you, Tony. Thank you to everyone out there in the world who is interested in this. This is obviously going to be something we'll probably keep touching base on in the future. So stay tuned to SONAR for all of that. And everyone have a great rest of your week. Thanks.